All right. Today it's my pleasure to introduce to you Randy Jackson. He's in the Agronomy Department, and he's also with the Wisconsin Energy Institute. He's from Los Angeles, California. He went to La Habra High School and then went to UC Riverside to major in baseball and minor in environmental sciences. What positions? You're a lefty? Wow.
You'll see it from my talk.
Okay. Gesticulating. Then he went up north in California and he went to Humboldt State University to get his master's degree in natural resources, and went down to the Bay at UC Berkeley to get his PhD in ecological system sciences. And then he came directly here to UW-Madison in 2003, where he enjoys ice fishing and snowmobiling. Not necessarily in that order. Is that fair enough?
Not baseball.
Not baseball. Yeah, you know. Does everybody remember when they shut down the baseball program here? Yeah. Ooh, that's not good. Tonight he's going to talk about what are the bottlenecks to bioenergy. Please join me in welcoming Randy Jackson back to Wednesday Night Live.
Thank you all very much. Thank you, Tom, for the introduction. It's great to be here. I was here 9 years ago, not too long after I had arrived in Wisconsin, to talk about bioenergy and my role in a big bioenergy grant. And frankly, you guys asked the hardest questions I've ever been asked before. And for 9 years, I've been trying to get some answers. And hopefully, I've come back with a few answers. But more seriously, I hope to give you some perspective on, from a grassland ecologist perspective, on where I see that we're at with bioenergy. 9 years ago, there was a whole lot of buzz and excitement about bioenergy. Gas prices were high, oil prices were high. Oil prices quickly dropped after that, and you know, I'm still excited about bioenergy, and that's why I'm happy to come and talk to you about it. You might wonder why, as an ecologist, am I so excited about bioenergy? And the reason I'm so excited about bioenergy is because I believe it offers us great hope and great promise to fix a lot of the environmental problems that we have out on the landscape, a lot of the environmental problems that we've made with our current agricultural systems and our current management of those systems. So what I've got here depicted on the screen is sometimes referred to as a supply chain, sometimes a pipeline, but the basic gist of it is that with energy from the sun, we can let plants turn that into their own biomass, and then take that biomass, some parts of it, and add some energy, either chemical, mechanical, or both, biological as well, and break down those plants into their component sugars, and then use microbes to convert those sugars into fuels. In particular, ethanol has had a great focus, but other types of fuels are likely as well out of that type of biological conversion platform. And so I want to talk a little bit about this tonight. The arc for my talk, if you will, or the outline here, is for me to first give a little background on bioenergy, biofuels, what we mean by that. It was clear to me the first time I came 9 years ago that I hadn't made it very clear the difference between what we know as first generation and second generation biofuels. And so most of the questions were kind of made me realize that I had conflated the two and didn't do a good job of explaining the differences. So I want to make sure I do that up front. And then talk a little bit about where we're at with our current biofuels in this country. And then I want to pivot to some exciting conversion technologies. And so when I talk about conversion, I'm hearkening back to these set of processes where we're converting plant biomass into forms of energy, into liquid forms of energy. And so you might wonder, why is an ecologist going to talk to us about this? I'm going to tell you everything I know about these conversion processes. It's a little bit superficial. But I want to talk about them because I think they have really important ramifications for what happens upstream in the supply chain, up in the landscape, out on the farmscape, in places where we grow these crops. And then I want to pivot to what I see as the biggest bottlenecks on an emerging bioeconomy. And I'll give you the takeaway message here. it's not conversion. It's not these processes that we use to convert plants into energy. They're more on the social, economic, and ecological side of things. And so I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And then I'll be bold enough to present what I think is sort of a vision for how we can break through these bottlenecks or push beyond them. So that's the overall outline. So why sustainable bioenergy? Why are we interested in sustainable bioenergy at all? The first and most obvious perhaps is a geopolitical reason. We'd like to get off our dependence on foreign oil, on foreign fossil fuels, and I've heard lots of arguments in both directions here that maybe that isn't such a good thing for us to get off of our dependence on foreign sources of energy. Nonetheless, it's the sort of the number one reason that's trotted out there. The second is that if it's in fact sustainable, if it's in fact renewable, then it should be sustainable. It should lend itself to a more sustainable supply of energy. And then, as I've mentioned before, there are environmental reasons to pivot to bioenergy and get off of fossil fuels and non-renewable fuels. So those are the main sort of driving factors behind bioenergy that we've talked about over the years. Okay, so here I go into my typology of biofuels, just so that I can assume we're all on the same page. So when we talk about biofuels, which would be what we talk about when we talk about liquid bioenergy, those can be broken into first generation biofuels, second generation, and third generation, and so on. But first generation biofuels, for short, are biofuels that are derived from the parts of plants that we use for food. Okay? So sugar beets, sugar cane, potatoes, and in this part of the world in particular, corn grain. Okay? And that's what most of our ethanol that we make nowadays comes from, corn grain, at least in the United States. So these first generation biofuels come from the food parts of plants. Second generation biofuels, sometimes referred to as lignocellulosic biomass, is energy that comes from the parts of plants or plants that we don't use for food. Okay, so if we think about a corn plant, second generation biofuels would be when we use the corn stalk, but not the grain for energy. It would be when we use wood chips from forest residues or from trees that are purposely grown. It might be switchgrass, which you've heard a lot about over the years. But it could be any type of plant material, and that's kind of part of the beauty of second generation biofuels. And so this has a lot of attraction for us for various reasons, and some which I'll get into here. The first is that it doesn't compete for food production necessarily, unless we replace first generation or food production areas with second generation plants. The second is, and maybe the most important, is that if we can use these, the cost of production of these plants tends to be very low, and so the net energy gain from them could be quite high if we can figure out good ways to use them. And then third generation biofuels would be algal biomass, and there are problems and issues with algal biomass, but it certainly holds a lot of promise down the line, and I'm not prepared to talk much about algal biomass at all. So that's sort of the overall typology for biofuels. And so one might ask, how have we responded as a nation, as a society, to this sort of drive towards biofuels and bioenergy? I mentioned the geopolitical drive, and that's seen here in the Energy Independence and Security Act of 2007 that President Bush signed into law, which provided the opportunity to develop what's known as the Renewable Fuel Standard, which is U.S. biofuel policy. Okay, and the Renewable Fuels Standard mandated that from 1995 through 2022, a significant amount of our gasoline supply would be supplanted, or maybe a better word is augmented, by ethanol. Okay? And not only that, a significant amount of it would come not only from first generation ethanol, corn starch ethanol, which we just talked about, but then that would be capped at some point in time that happened a couple of years ago at about 15 billion gallons. And after that, no more ethanol from corn starch ethanol, from corn grain ethanol could come into the gasoline supply. It mandated then that this wedge of blue stripes that increased over time would continue to grow to 2022 and beyond. And that set of blue stripe wedges there, whatever you call that, those blue stripes, that is so-called second generation biofuels, lignocellulosic biofuels that come from the non-food parts of plants, so switchgrass, trees, etc. Now we haven't actually realized those production numbers. You can see here that the y-axis is billions of gallons, and I think by 2016 or 2017, we were producing something on the order of a couple 100 million gallons of cellulosic biomass. And so that answers the question, what are the bottlenecks on achieving these goals? Our first generation biorefineries have certainly spread across the landscape. They're, if you drive through Iowa, they're in every nook of cranny of corn country, often co-located with grain mills and that sort of thing, grain elevators. But there's a lot of them, and they're very concentrated, as you can see here, in the Corn Belt. So we've responded dramatically. And you might ask, how has that helped us reduce our dependence on foreign oil? And so on this plot, you can see that from 2005, the top line here is imported oil. This green line is domestic crude oil, so domestically produced oil. And then this blue line down here is ethanol production. Again, almost entirely from corn grain. So we did significantly ramp up our corn grain production, but it's hard to stare at these lines and imagine that this increase in corn grain production has been the reason that we've relied less on foreign oil. It's primarily because we ramped up our domestic production of oil. Nonetheless, I think it shows that as a society we can respond and change the way we produce energy. And if, you might argue that if the limits that were mandated for corn grain ethanol weren't put in place, that might have continued to grow. Because we know that farmers love to grow corn, and they love to grow corn for ethanol. So have we reduced our dependence on oil? The other part about this plot is that it plateaus around 2010, as you can see. And I think the estimates are that about 40%, maybe 35% of all the corn that we grew in the US that year went to ethanol. And so if we tripled that, you know, and put all of our corn grain into ethanol, the estimate is that we could replace about 1 out of 6 gallons of gasoline. And of course, this all assumes that we're just using the same amount of gasoline going forward, but we know that that's not the case, right? We continue to use more and more gasoline. Okay. So I'm not here to argue either way about whether or not corn grain ethanol has helped us with our overall energy needs. But I do want to argue that it's been a small part of the bigger picture. Nonetheless, we have been able to respond in significant ways. But there are a lot of detractors of corn grain ethanol and first generation biofuels in particular. And so the cartoon that I'm about to show you is quite unseemly in my estimation, but I want to show it to you because it's an indication of sort of the rancor in the discussion. But this is the kind of argument that's out there. The argument goes that we shouldn't be taking food out of hungry people's hands, out of their mouths, and putting it into our gas tanks. So this is sort of epitomizes the food versus fuel debate that I mentioned earlier. Of course, this all supposes that the corn that we're producing in the Midwest is somehow making it to hungry people's plates, hungry people outside the US in particular. And you know, as far as I'm concerned, that's not a valid assumption. That's simply not happening. what does happen to the corn that we produce in this nation? Well, most of it goes to feed livestock. Most of it goes to feed livestock that are in confinement situations. And poverty-stricken people generally aren't consuming meat and livestock products. A significant amount of it, sorry about the colors here, but over in this box over here, a significant amount of it goes to sweeteners, basically, soda. That's what a significant fraction of our corn goes to. Here in the middle is our fuel ethanol box. So that's, as I mentioned, maybe 35 or 40% of the corn we produce. And then a significant amount of it goes to exports for use elsewhere. So I'm showing you this to sort of undermine the argument of food versus fuel. One has to really buy into the fact that corn is producing a significant amount of very healthy calories. Moreover, if we look over time, so here's 1980, 2000, 2005, 2015, at where our corn is going, we really haven't changed the overall distribution. The blue is feed, and so you can see that we haven't really changed that part. The exported part hasn't really changed much. We've really just added more corn production to satisfy the ethanol demand. So as Senator Chuck Grassley from Iowa said, there's nothing negative about ethanol. It's good, good, good. And I haven't even gotten to the environmental aspects yet. So there are problems with corn-based ethanol. Before I get to the environmental problems, and maybe this is an environmental problem epitomized, one of the main problems with it is that it basically takes about the same amount of energy to produce corn grain ethanol as it provides. So it's about a net zero energy gain. Whereas my colleague Jason Hill at the University of Minnesota said, it's really just a way to find, to put natural gas and coal into our gas tanks. Because we're just burning other fossil fuels to take corn grain, liquefy it, and put it in our gas tanks.
Wow.
And I could stand up here all night and talk about problems, environmental problems of growing corn. I don't think you'd have to drive very far outside the city limits to find this scene right now. I saw this, this scene at least 3 times yesterday as I drove outside the city limits. Bare soil, corn is starting to grow now, but lots of runoff, lots of erosion. And that, of course, you wouldn't have to go very long into the summer before you encounter a closed beach as a result of the nutrients and sediments that enter into the lakes around here. I know I was turned away from Lake Wingra 3 times last summer. This is a significant nightmare locally and at the continental scale as well. So we have what's known as the hypoxic zone in the Gulf of Mexico as a result of nitrogen and phosphorus, but largely nitrogen, that moves from the upper reaches of the Mississippi River watershed every year into the Mississippi drainage, eventually finds its way into the Gulf of Mexico, and in some years virtually shuts down the shrimping industry. Okay, so we're taking one sector of food production and harming another with it, and it's just not sustainable. Not to mention greenhouse gas emissions, which come from producing crops like corn. So here's continuous corn on the left, grown at 2 sites, and these are data from my own lab. You can see that adding some rotations into the system, canola and soybean, reduce the greenhouse gas emissions significantly. But when we grow perennial crops, like restored prairie or switchgrass or native grasses, that we significantly reduce the amount of greenhouse gases going in the atmosphere. There's always going to be some background level of nitrous oxide, in this case, being emitted from the soils. But when we add the kind of nitrogen we add to grow corn and grow other annual crops, we really stimulate nitrous oxide emissions to the atmosphere. And then finally, on the biodiversity front, lots of work from my friend Claudio Graton here at UW and Doug Landis and his grad student Ben Werling at Michigan State University has shown that when you compare corn systems, labeled here as maize, when you compare corn systems to switchgrass and prairie, in all these different categories of biodiversity: birds, bees, lady beetles, bacteria in the soil that are beneficial because they consume methane out of the atmosphere, grasshoppers, plants, that the diversity, measured in many different ways, is always lower in the annual system, in the corn system. Not only that, they've been able to demonstrate that the lower numbers of diversity actually relate to lower ecosystem services provided. So in the case of the lady beetle, say, it results in lower predation on pests of soybeans in neighboring fields. So there, you have to connect some dots there, but pollinators, the same situation. Less pollination services, fewer pollination services with lower diversity of bees, and so on. Okay, so hopefully by now I've convinced you that first generation biofuels are not the answer, but they've been a significant sort of demonstration by our society that we can respond to a call for some liquid transportation fuel other than fossil fuel. So let's talk a little bit about second generation biofuels research. A lot of this research has been going on here at UW-Madison. And as I mentioned, a lot of it has been happening in this conversion area. We call this deconstruction, where we try to break up this biomass and turn it into these sugars. And then the conversion is this microbial-driven process. And I think I mentioned earlier, but I'll just redouble here. When you look at plant material, the plant biomass, so imagine this is one strand in a leaf of switchgrass, most of that plant biomass is made up of these three constituents: cellulose, which is maybe 40 or 45% of that biomass; hemicellulose, which is this heavier material that sort of winds its way in and around the cellulose to hold it together and give it strength; and then this even higher molecular weight material, lignin, which grows in between the cell walls and in and among the cell walls and really allows the plant to stand up. It gives it its ability to withstand wind and rain and that sort of thing. Also provides resistance to decomposition and attack from grasshoppers and attack from microbes. It's sort of nature's way of making sure that we don't break it down and turn it into ethanol. And so much of the research has been trying to overcome, trying to figure out ways to take this material, break it up into its component parts so that the microbes can access particularly the cellulose and turn that into sugars and eventually ethanol. So we've had some very exciting breakthroughs here on this campus and also with our collaborators at Michigan State. And I want to talk about two of them. One of them is called ammonia fiber expansion, AFEX. This is an alkaline pre-treatment of the biomass that again helps break it up and let microbes get in to access it. And this has been pioneered by a fellow named Bruce Dale at Michigan State University and working with folks at their de-risking institute there called MBI. And the beauty of what they've done with this is not only develop the physics and chemistry behind it on the bench, but they've also scaled it up and developed this sort of landscape design for how it might be used. And they call these local biomass processing depots. So I want to talk a little bit about that. I mentioned that these technologies have ramifications up into the landscape, and this is part of it. The second is this process that uses a chemical called gamma Valero lactone, which is a solvent that's extracted from the biomass itself. I don't know the chemistry behind it, but they do something to concentrate it or make it super powerful. If somebody's here, they can help me explain more about it. But they take that and they use that again to help break up the biomass, and it breaks it up in a way that allows for these very distinct streams to come out of the biomass. So rather than me waving my hands, I'll show you some pictures. First, the AFEX process. So the biomass comes in as raw biomass. So this is just shredded up corn stover here, corn stems. And it's put into a reactor vessel with ammonia and some pressure. And over time, not very much time, that there's sort of an explosion in that vessel that results in the biomass being broken apart physically, but chemically, those three components are separated, and as it comes out of the vessel, the lignin itself sort of settles on the outside of the material and acts as a bonding agent, so that then when they extrude that biomass and make pellets out of it, the lignin serves to sort of hold those pellets together and concentrate the cellulose and the hemicellulose inside the pellets. That's an oversimplification of something that people spend a decade working on, so forgive me. But this is really exciting because these pellets help us overcome one of the huge bottlenecks to bioenergy, which is that when we harvest biomass, it's very light and fluffy and full of air and water and expensive to transport. And so one of the reasons they like this for local biomass processing is because we could have little AFEX treatment plants all over the landscape, like say at the scale of grain elevators. And that's where the AFEX and densification could happen. And once it's dense, then it's much easier to transport. In fact, it's just like corn. Even more, it's just like corn when you feed it to livestock. It's not quite like corn with respect to the quality, okay? But it approaches it. And there's more studies going on for how we might bump up the quality of that pellet so that, again, it could be, dare I say, a replacement for corn that comes from some sort of process that's much more sustainable, much more sustainably produced. Yeah, you have a question?
Can the pellets be converted to liquid fuel?
Yeah, absolutely. That was actually the motivation. The question is, can the pellets be converted to liquid fuel? Thank you for queuing me up and keeping me moving. The idea here is that the landscape is where you produce the biomass. You get it to these local biomass processing depots. The AFEX pelletization happens, and then it can ultimately go to a biorefinery or power plant where it can be combusted and burned for energy, or it could be turned into liquid transportation fuel with these microbial processes. But one of the big bottlenecks to getting bioenergy going has been sort of the chicken and the egg problem. Like, what should come first, the biorefinery? Well, they're not there yet. So who's going to invest in this? And who's going to do that if people aren't growing this? Well, here's a sector that is there. We've got a lot of livestock out there. And so if we can use these pellets to feed an existing market, then that jumpstarts, potentially, people's interest in locating these biorefinery power plants. So I see this as a really exciting development, and I know a lot of other people do too. And I know I haven't done justice to the actual mechanics and physics and chemistry of the process, but it makes me excited nonetheless. And it must be important because former President Obama toured the MBI plant. Here's Bruce Dale, where they're actually showing him how this AFEX process works. So it must have been important. All right, so the second process that I want to talk about is this gamma Valero lactone, which enables what they've dubbed as the triversa process. And so I mentioned the gamma Valero lactone is a solvent that they extract from the plant biomass itself. In this particular development situation, they've been using a woody material, and they break it into these three streams: the cellulose, which they get this dissolving pulp, which is a precursor for rayon and other textiles. They get furfural, which is a precursor for specialty chemicals, including biofuels. And then they get a high purity lignin, which is, sorry, I should have said that the furfural comes from the hemicellulose stream. And then they get high purity lignin from the lignin stream. And that lignin can be turned into things like carbon foam for cars. They also talk in their paper about how it can be very useful in building batteries. So what's really exciting about this is that they capture almost all of the cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin that comprises the plant. There's virtually no waste of the plant material, which is a huge step forward. And that's a result of the gamma Valero lactone process. Now, they've undertaken what's known as a technoeconomic analysis, which is to say, not just back of the envelope numbers. They've actually penciled out in great detail whether this would work, whether this would be attractive for, say, siting a biorefinery. And the takeaway from this is that the feedstock cost, that is the purchase of the white birch to start with, is a huge portion of the overall cost. And they estimate that they would pay a farmer $125 per ton of biomass to get that white birch. That's pretty good if you're a farmer. You'd be pretty excited about that. And when they pencil this all out, they estimate a biorefinery profit of $500 a ton. Again, that would be pretty attractive to investment capital types of folks. So this pencils out profit-wise for both the producer of the energy as well as the producer of the biomass, the feedstock. And so I just took this a little bit farther. If you're going to pay the farmer $125 a ton for biomass, right now switchgrass yields on average 3.5 tons per acre per year. All right? And there are, my friend Mike Kasler, who's a switchgrass breeder, he'll come here and tell you that he can get 10 tons per acre in 5 years. And I'm laughing because I always poke him about this. He may have said that 5 years ago too. But they're working hard on improving switchgrass so that it's even more productive. And as you'll see when we run through the numbers here, that's going to be a huge leap forward. If he or she's going to get $125 a ton for 3.5 tons per acre, that's $437 per acre. We keep track of our costs here agronomic-wise for growing switchgrass, and I have hard numbers that show that it costs over an 8-year period about $100 per acre to grow switchgrass. A big investment up front, it's expensive to plant and get established. It's not very productive early, but over time, it costs less to maintain. So the net farmer income in this situation would be about $337 per acre per year. That's pretty good. In Illinois, I just scraped this off the internet. You can find any number of these kinds of extension handouts, and I'm not going to walk through all the numbers. In Illinois, on high productivity land with corn and soybeans grown on it, the net return might be $333 per acre. On lower productivity land that soils aren't as good, $291. On even less lower productivity land, about $200 an acre. So why not switchgrass with this process? The economics pencil out, at least these types of economics. My friend Brad Barham here in the Ag and Applied Econ department published a study recently, and the study's title is something like Inconvenient Truths, Farmer Unwillingness to Produce Biomass. And so really the takeaway message of this paper is it's more than just those economics I just showed you. You might call those back of the envelope sketch numbers, but they kind of made me excited. What he was able to do with surveys, working with my colleague Scott Swenton at Michigan State, what he was able to do was show that when they surveyed farmers across many sectors, it takes a while to get oriented to this plot, so let me walk through it a little bit. When they surveyed farmers and asked them about their willingness to plant land in corn or to plant it in switchgrass under different land rents. So in other words, they might come to me and say, hey Randy, if I gave you $75 an acre, would you plant corn? And I'd say yes or no. And then they'd say, what about switchgrass for $75 an acre? So anyway, the takeaway is that out of their results, what they were able to show is that farmers were more willing to plant corn than switchgrass at the same prices. So this gets at, it's not just a price signal. It's not just what am I going to make, what does it cost, what am I going to make. There's something else about it that's not just straight up economics. And maybe Brad would say, this actually is economics. This is the point. There are opportunity costs that you haven't factored into your back of the envelope calculations. There's a lot that goes into planting switchgrass, and once you plant it, you're in it. And you don't play the market necessarily. You're in it for the long haul. And if you're not, if you tear it up and go into corn the next year, or you go back into soybeans, you lose any benefits you get, environmental benefits you get of having planted perennial crops. And so it makes sense that there's a lot more flexibility with annual crops like corn and soybeans. even at the same price signals. And I should say that the results were similar in Michigan, but these diverged strongly at higher levels in Wisconsin. You can see that they were always sort of separated in Michigan. What they were also able to sort out is beyond this idea of sort of opportunity cost between perennial crops and annual crops. When you broke it down by sector, there were big differences. And so, for instance, in Wisconsin, where more of the farmers were dairy farmers, they were much more reticent to say they would plant switchgrass no matter what price you would give them. Because, you know, when we did follow-up interviews with them, they just had to feed their livestock. And they didn't see switchgrass as a feed for their livestock at the time. Whereas cash grain farmers, which were more prevalent in Michigan, would just grow corn and soybeans and sell it on the market. The idea of going into a different crop wasn't as difficult for them to get their head around. Yes, sir.
Quick question, if I'm understanding, but what's the yield, the dollar yield for an acre of switchgrass versus corn? Doesn't corn provide a lot more cash per acre?
Well, the earlier set of slides that I was walking you through was showing that based on this new technology, it looks like about $330 per acre on high productivity land. So they're in the same ballpark. One's a theoretical market, one's an actual market. That's part of the takeaway here. Nonetheless, there's lots of land out there that is very often not profitable in corn. This is work from Brandis from Iowa State, who looked at profitability of acreage in Iowa over several years, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and then modeled it for 2015. The darker oranger areas are areas that were less than zero profitability that year for corn production. The areas that are green were positive, and I'm sorry for the size of the legend here, but this goes up to negative $200 per acre. So some people who are really, really dark orange lost up to greater than $200 per acre. And then this goes up to positive $1,000 per acre for the dark green. Yeah, question?
Sorry, I was wondering, so farmers have crop insurance on corn. I don't know if that's available for switchgrass, but when a farmer loses their money in that corn,
Right.
collecting it on insurance.
Right, and so that's not built into these profitability estimates. That's a very good point. That farmers have insurance that covers these losses. And that's queuing up my next point, so thank you. Yes.
I kind of know what corn is. I don't really know the characteristics of switchgrass. Can cattle eat it?
Oh,
Is it
sure.
a better carbon sequester? Can you graze it?
Sure, yes, the answer is yes to all of those questions. You can graze it. People don't tend to graze it this far east in the country, but once you move west of the 100th meridian, once you move into rangeland, a lot of cattle graze native wild switchgrass. Some farmers harvest it for hay and use it for hay. In this part of the world, we have higher quality grasses that farmers tend to use to feed to their livestock. It is a better carbon sequestration plant than corn because it has a much more significant and developed root system than corn. And because we don't disturb the soil once it's planted, it's a perennial. That's the key thing.
And if it's in your cornfield, is it a noxious weed?
I wouldn't say it's noxious, but it's a weed. A weed, the definition of a weed is a plant that somebody doesn't want there. A noxious weed is one that somebody doesn't want there and they can't do anything about it. Or very little about it. Yes, sir.
Did the prediction that drove your slide for 2015 that makes essentially all of Iowa a net loss for corn growers actually happen? I just can't believe it.
I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question. I thought about that when I was putting this slide together, because when I first put this slide together, it hadn't been 2015 yet. That's a good question. I don't know.
Do you know the reason for the change that's going on there?
The reason for the change is the trade-off, not trade-off, but it's multiple variables. One is the price of corn, for each year. So as the price goes up and down, that affects profitability. But then the yields is a huge part of it, so it's largely weather driven. Yeah. But as you can see from the variation across Iowa, it's not just weather driven, it's also soils driven. And that's sort of part of the message here, is that there are parts of the landscape that shouldn't be growing corn, right? But we subsidize it and we incentivize it so people grow it. And if we could subsidize and incentivize something like switchgrass that stores more carbon and is a potential feedstock for bioenergy and has all kinds of other environmental benefits, that's what we should be incentivizing.
You had $4.80 for the price of bushel of corn. Right now, if you're looking at fall 17, it's more like $3.50, $3.40. That's a big difference.
That's a big difference.
And last year it was about $3.50 bushel
Yeah.
too, on average for the fall.
But do you remember what the
Yeah.
price of corn was when the corn ethanol boom first started?
It was in $4.80, exactly.
It was $8.90.
Yeah, it was more than
Yeah, I remember $9 a
that. For the fall,
bushel.
last year.
So that drove a tremendous amount of corn biomass on the landscape.
In Iowa.
Yes, sir.
The $125 a ton reference point for those numbers per acre value, what was the price of either gasoline or fuel oil, or not fuel, oil for that reference point in order to drive that to be used on the other end?
Yeah, I don't know.
In other
It
words,
wasn't
does
my
that convert
paper.
to make
I just know that they've picked $125 as sort of a, I mean, they had to pick a number to run their model, and they asked some experts, what might you pay people? I know that $80 per ton has been sort of a benchmark for a long time. And so when I saw 125, that's part of what got me thinking, wow, this could actually be productive for the farmer.
But conversely, we don't know what that would do at the pump or cost.
True, right. We could follow this through. What does that do to prices at the pump? How does that feed back? Right. Good questions. Good questions. So my point here is that there's a lot of land out there that we could consider planting something more sustainable and feeding through these new processes. And then just to hammer that home, as we move our spatial scale in even closer, and look at sort of the farm field level, there are some places, this is the same kind of map, and black here is losing $500 an acre. There are some places that never are profitable growing corn. And these are what we call, sometimes you hear them called marginal lands. It's where the price of the input costs don't cover what you get in sales. But again, going back to the gentleman's point, the government takes care of that with insurance and price supports and that sort of thing. But the land is out there, the biomass is out there. This is a study that Ilya Gelfand from Michigan State did of the 9 or 10 state north central region. And what they did was say, okay, let's forget about that corn land. Let's just pick truly marginal land, which is land that's not producing any food right now. Okay, so let's not even think about displacing corn production, which is kind of what I was alluding to with the last two slides. Let's just pick areas that aren't producing corn or soybeans or wheat. They're fallow. Let's exclude forests. Let's exclude wetlands. They did their due diligence in that regard. And just ask how much biomass is out there. And so the colors represent here how much biomass is actually available. And these were model-generated results. And then what they did was say, okay, in order to locate a biorefinery, we would need some amount that, you know, the biorefinery experts gave them. Some amount of biomass would have to be available to make it reasonable to site a biorefinery in that area. And so then, based on their estimates of available biomass, they drew these circles where it would make sense because there was a so-called fuel shed for the biomass to come support the biorefinery. And this is the kind of map they were able to develop. So again, this is a way of getting plant biomass and turning it into energy in a way that doesn't compete with food, because it'd be coming from land that isn't producing food now. Now, I have problems with this, which we could talk about for a long time. When I look at Nebraska, I see that one of the hot spots is the Sand Hills, which is rangeland that has livestock on it. There are lots of places there that I don't think we should be planting and harvesting biofuels crops. And so we have to be, this is a very coarse level way of observing this, but you have to get on the ground and do some ground truthing when you do these modeling studies. One of the problems that we have is that we don't have years and years and years of agronomic data on crops like switchgrass or miscanthus or native grasses and how we harvest them. And so this is our harvest efficiency, which is to say what fraction of all the above ground biomass that grew this year were we actually able to harvest? Did we actually recover in our harvest? A lot of the biomass sort of blows around in the field. There's stubble laying on the ground. Some of it blows out of the truck. And as you can see here, the numbers were pretty miserable with our restored prairie and our successional field, which is pretty much just weeds, but we harvest them anyway. We could only harvest about 40% of the biomass. So there are agronomic questions that need to be addressed still. So all this is to say, maybe that's why when we look at the Wikipedia list of commercial cellulosic ethanol plants in the US, it's a short list. And I believe several of these may have already gone out of business since I scraped it off of the internet. But as you can see when you scan down this list, they're primarily focusing on agricultural residues and forest residues or wood products. That is to say, they're not focusing on things like switchgrass, which are dedicated plants to provide energy. And a lot of that has to do with sort of the agronomic uncertainty with growing these crops. So, why hasn't sustainable bioenergy emerged? Here are my opinions based on the data that we have and from my working in this for 9 years. Farmers are nervous. That's a colloquial way of saying they're uncertain about the markets, they're uncertain about the agronomics, there's these opportunity costs. They're just not ready to go in whole hog yet. But I know from talking to farmers that if these things were overcome, they're ready to go. They're very keen to respond to economic signals that would drive them to plant more sustainable crops. I'm painting with a broad brush, but the farmers that I've talked to are keen to do that. As I've said, the markets are uncertain. This is related to the gentleman's point about subsidies. You saw that the back of the envelope numbers are pretty close for income generation, for profitability between, say, switchgrass and corn. If we could swing some of our subsidies, some of our payments, some of our insurance towards switchgrass and other perennial grasses, I think we could see a sea change here and stabilize some markets. And maybe one way to do that is a carbon market. One way to do that is with insurance and price supports. And then finally, without belaboring it, the reality is that entrenched interests fight against the development of a second generation biofuels market. If you are a winner in the first generation game, you're not that keen to see a second generation game, okay? If you're selling corn seed, you're not keen to see second generation biofuels displace corn growing somewhere. Ditto if you're selling nitrogen fertilizer. You have entrenched interests. And that's not a, I'm not saying that to cast aspersions. I think that, operating in your best interest is the way our markets work. But the government has a huge role to play here to incentivize people to act in their best interest in ways that are good for society as a whole. So I want to offer just a quick vision for how I think things can change. At least it's been something that I and my colleagues have been working on for a while now. I think we have to pull together and unite forces for change that might seem sort of disparate on their face and get them together to help demand these types of land use changes, these kind of landscape changes that we see here on this, depicted on this map. So what we have here is a situation where we have intensive cropland, something like corn, that provides low water quality regulation, low water flow, low biodiversity habitat. I've kind of tried to convince you that these things are happening, but a high value for crop production. As we move into a new landscape where croplands with restored ecosystem services provide not only production, but also biodiversity and water flow regulation and carbon sequestration and all these other kinds of ecosystem services that we care about. If we're going to get those types of landscapes, then we have to have people demanding not only clean energy, but clean water and clean human health, or better improved human health. We have to bring these forces together. And one way this is happening now, I wouldn't say on a small scale, it's at a fairly large scale, is with the Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District, who has a program called Yahara Wins. That's a collaboration with farmers where they're looking for win-win solutions on the landscape to reduce phosphorus load into the Yahara River water bodies. And that's an example of the kind of collaboration that really needs to happen in order for us to overcome these entrenched interests and market uncertainty. But it's hard, it's tricky, it's a wicked problem because I can't keep straight in my head how to paint the landscape in order to improve ecosystem services because ecosystem services trade off. And so here's the Yahara River watershed with Lake Mendota, Lake Monona, et cetera. And what you see from these model outputs of various types of services is that when we paint the landscape one way, crop production might be high, fresh water supply might be low, surface water quality might be moderate, groundwater quantity might be low. There's trade-offs. Carbon sequestration trades off. And we need these sophisticated models to kind of tell us, here are the hot spots on the landscape. Here are the leverage points where a little bit of perennial grass, a little bit of switchgrass would make a huge difference in terms of holding onto water, holding onto nitrogen, holding onto phosphorus, building soil carbon. My colleague Claudio Graton has been working on developing this type of a modeling system that keeps track of many different ecosystem services at once. Here's another type of spider diagram showing you how all these services trade off. And the beauty of this tool that he's developing is that you can look at the landscape. Here's Lake Mendota, northwest of Lake Mendota. You can look at these landscapes and query the landscape and say, show me all the places on the landscape that are growing corn within 10 meters of a water body. And that's what essentially these red areas, these pink, red shaded areas are. So the model has pulled out those areas. And then he can run a scenario and say, okay, now transform all of those areas from corn into switchgrass. And then what does that do to phosphorus reduction? What does that do to carbon sequestration? How does that affect farmer profitability? How does that affect net income for the farmer? And it's only by visualizing all these trade-offs, I think, that we're going to be able to see real change on the landscape. So we have to develop these cutting-edge models, these tools, and then we have to develop social systems, what I call here a sustainability process, where stakeholders are brought together with those tools. And they can all sit down, the stakeholders, and look at these landscape changes and see what the trade-offs are and see where the synergies are and come to solutions on a local level on their own. And I think that's the only way we call this a sustainability process because I think the solutions that come out of there are sustainable, more sustainable than top-down solutions where the government says, okay, here's where the hotspots are. You're going to plant this, you're going to plant that. That's never going to fly. We've got to get farmers and agency folks around the table to play with these models so that they can see, you know, it's really farmer A, unfortunately, whose land is contributing the phosphorus. What can we all do to help farmer A be whole here when we ask him to switch into switchgrass or into some other more benign crop? And so this type of sustainability process will require a lot of expertise, a lot of expert facilitation. Here's an example of my friend at University of Minnesota actually engaged in this type of process where they're looking at the landscape and saying, oh, look, if I put switchgrass over here, I can actually increase my profitability and hold on to carbon and hold on to nutrients. So by co-opting and combining these forces, we start to valorize, I like that term, or add value to healthy ecosystems. Ecosystems that provide lots of different ecosystem services for us. And we demand those as a society and overcome this inertia that is behind the bottlenecks to second generation bioenergy. So I'll just summarize. We've shown capacity to change in the energy sector. First generation biofuels have been a big step forward, but they have a lot of problems. We need to move on. These key breakthroughs have been happening on the conversion side, and I think they empower and enable what happens on the landscape. There are still bottlenecks, though, on the supply side. In particular, as I mentioned, they're in the social and economic and ecological realms. And then, as I just said, we have to harness and grow societal demand for these healthy ecosystems to overcome the entrenched interests and the inertia behind the markets so that we can get a clean bioenergy sector. So I'll end there and be happy to entertain questions or discussion. Yes, sir.
Could you comment, please, on the state of the art of algae as a biofuel?
The answer is no. I can't comment on the state of the art of algae as a biofuel. I can only tell you my sort of scientific American understanding of it, which is that it shows great promise. You know, similar to what I showed you, it shows great promise on paper, but it requires a tremendous amount of sunlight and sun energy. So it's best for places that are hot, like deserts, but it also requires a lot of water. And so, you know, it's been sort of, I think they're doing the de-risking and whatnot in very hot, arid environments, but it's a big water suck, and the sustainability of it falls apart. That may be a very dogmatic sort of understanding of it, but that's my understanding of it. So I'm sorry I can't give you more details on it. Yes, back here.
I was just wondering how much of an issue it is there a need for specialized equipment for harvesting switchgrass and how much that affects things?
Good question. The question is, are there specialized equipment needs for harvesting things like switchgrass and these other perennial grasses and trees? And the answer is specialized, but not wacky. You know, we have the equipment to do it. Often it's modified, but farmers modify their equipment on the fly all the time. It's easy enough to do it with forage harvesting equipment when you're talking about grasses. Certainly in the tree industry, the pulp industry has developed all kinds of methods for just like coming in with these big tree cutters and making chips and throwing them into a box. So I would say that that part of things is somewhat trivial, although as I say that I can hear my biological systems engineering folks cringing. There are lots of developments that would help, but I don't think they're insurmountable.
So are there other native grasses that could substitute for switchgrass, you know, the blue stems, Indian grass, and so forth?
The question is, are there other native grasses that would substitute for switchgrass, like big blue stem and Indian grass, et cetera? And the answer is yes. Switchgrass is the poster child for perennial grasses for bioenergy, largely because DOE has invested a lot of money into switchgrass. But big blue stem and Indian grass perform quite well in our field trials. There is some concern about their longevity. Switchgrass, it looks like, has a pretty good life cycle of 8 or 9 years of pretty high productivity in some cases. Big blue stem and Indian grass, they're bunchier and tend to not last as long. But I think that there are questions about how we manage it that could overcome that. But we have mixed plantings where we grow all these grasses combined, and they perform very nicely compared to switchgrass. Yes?
Regarding adding CO2 and other greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, how does producing biofuels, everything from planting and cultivating and processing, compare to the same process using fossil fuels?
So let me understand your question. How does the carbon balance, I think is what you said,
Yeah,
of
comparison.
planting perennial crops compared to annual crops?
No,
Processing.
I'm talking
sorry.
about, biofuels compared to just burning fossil fuels. The whole chain from
Oh.
beginning to actually using and burning it for energy.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that these processes, well, I don't even want to go there. I don't know the answer to that. Maybe this gentleman has an answer.
Is there a life cycle assessment metric that you use in your research dollars to answer that previous question?
There are life cycle assessment metrics, but I'm not aware of comparisons of biomass combustion with converting it into ethanol. You know, most of the life cycle assessment studies that I've seen are comparing what happens when you use switchgrass instead of a diverse mix of plants or corn for the same process. I haven't seen different processes compared like that. Yeah.
Well, if you go to the NREL, they're trying to harmonize life cycle assessment with energy return on investment. So that's a hard metric to qualify, but if you Google their site, they're working on it.
Yes.
You didn't talk about how energy efficient or how energy productive these new technologies are compared to the ones that you have for the first generation fuels.
Yeah, I haven't talked about how energy efficient second generation biofuels are compared to first generation.
Processes, the technology processes in terms of taking the biomass and turning it into energy.
Yeah.
There wasn't much of a gain with first generation processes. And you brought up these second generation processes, but you didn't talk about how effective they were in terms of producing energy.
Right. The second generation processes, as they've been penciled out, have been shown, like with switchgrass and other types of perennial grasses, have been shown to have a net energy gain that is something close to 100-fold because of the low input production costs and the high energy gain. The input production costs include not only what it costs to plant the crop, so buying the seed or driving the tractor to plant it, but the embodied costs, getting back to life cycle assessment, the embodied costs in the fuel that you use to plant it and the fuel that was, or the carbon that was produced to produce the nitrogen to fertilize the crops, et cetera. I can't give you a better number than about 100 times, which is one of the reasons that people are so excited about it. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Excuse me. Do we know the energy per acre that can be harvested from, say, an acre of switchgrass? The net energy per acre that you can harvest?
Do we know the net energy per acre? Yes, we do, but I don't know it off the top of my head.
Okay. And I'm wondering, sort of a corollary question is whether you know how much acreage would be necessary to supply some given percentage of our national energy consumption. You know, do we have enough acreage in this country to
Yeah.
produce a significant amount?
Do we have enough acreage in the country to produce a significant amount of energy?
Some percentage?
Yeah, the NREL has done quite a few studies like this where they've looked again at, similar to what I showed you, all of the land that's not producing food right now in the U.S. And their back of the envelope numbers are very convincing that there is enough land to produce biomass to meet our energy needs, at least in the foreseeable future. Yeah, and to significantly displace fossil fuel use.
So would the NREL be a source for these other numbers as well?
Yeah.
So, I guess I'm trying to understand, is switchgrass kind of like, right now you can grow switchgrass like you grow hay, and hay is something that you feed your animals, and there's an immediate market for it right now without these biorefineries. And with that immediate market, is it true that a hay farmer makes $300 an acre just like a corn farmer makes $300 an acre outside of this, and I guess the subsidies impact that?
Yeah. So a hay farmer is not making $300 an acre by selling hay. And that's because it's a relatively low value commodity, relatively low value commodity. The $300 an acre I was showing you, if you harvested switchgrass and ran it through this Triversa process, would be adding value to that crop as it went through the process. And so that's why the net income would be higher on that. Of course, that's a theoretical market. The hay market is real. And so,
So the hay market might do a lot better if there were a lot of these tri-valent processing units nearby.
maybe. Yes, sir.
I don't know anything about switchgrass. Do you harvest it once a year, or do you harvest it once a month?
Do you harvest switchgrass once a year or once a month? We've looked at several studies where we've harvested it 2 or 3 times a year as well as once a year. And once a year is what makes the most sense. The reason for that is that you harvest it after the first killing frost of the season. So late October, early November, after that perennial grass has resorbed, which means taken a lot of the nutrients that are in its above ground biomass and moved them back below ground into its roots. Then you come and harvest that biomass. And the plant stores those nutrients below ground, which helps it come out of the winter very productive. If you harvest that biomass before it's had a chance to store its nutrients below ground, we have overwintering issues. You come out into spring and the plant does not rebound very well.
And then, does it need regular fertilization, or is it just what you need to get it started? First planting, and after that, it's good for 10 years with nothing.
Good
You
question.
Just go out there and harvest it at the
Now you're in my wheelhouse. The question was, do you need to fertilize it year after year, or do you just plant it and let it go? It's very interesting. There's been hundreds and hundreds of studies of switchgrass and other perennial grasses across the U.S. And switchgrass responds about half the time to nitrogen, and about half the time it doesn't. In other words, sometimes you get a yield response and sometimes you don't. And it really has been made for one of the most interesting research questions we've had, which is, how could this be? What is it about the plant? More pointedly, what is it about possibly associations the plant has with microbes in the soil who might be making nitrogen available or might not under different situations? So, to answer your question, if we want to replace the amount of nitrogen that we harvest every year, which has kind of been our approach, because when you harvest the biomass, you do take some nitrogen, we need to put back about 65 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare per year. But the plant doesn't use what we put back. So it's very interesting. We're trying to get to the bottom of this. There's some evidence that the plants have what's called an associative relationship with bacteria in the soil who fix nitrogen, and the plant oozes carbon out into the soil. The microbes use the carbon and make more nitrogen available for the plant. And then my grad student who just graduated was able to show that switchgrass has this association with fungi in the soil, fungus, arbuscular mycorrhizal fungi, and that fungal relationship, that symbiosis, can provide as much as 70 or 80% of the plant's nitrogen needs. But when we add nitrogen, it suppresses the ability of the mycorrhizae to give it that nitrogen. So this is one of the frontiers that you've hit on here, is how do we really manage these systems for sustainability? Because nitrogen is one of the most expensive input costs to any cropping system. So if we could put less on, that'd be a good thing. Yes?
I was wondering, what's the research that's going on in the rest of the world on this? I think of Brazil, Australia, New Zealand.
What's the research going on in the rest of the world?
What are they doing?
What are they doing? So they're actually, they're doing research, but they actually have implemented a sugar-based process based on sugar cane and produce a lot of biofuel in Brazil. And they have, of course, excess, maybe not an excess, but a tremendous amount of sugar cane growing there. And in Europe, they produce a lot of bioenergy from this plant miscanthus that I didn't talk about here, that they plant and grow, and they make pellets out of it. They feed it into burners at a very local scale. We're not making a tremendous amount of ethanol, though, liquid transportation fuel. One more question?
Are there currently any, a whole system set up processing a big field of switchgrass? Is there a place like that where they're actually trying it in a
Absolutely.
industrial?
Yeah. The question is there a place where they have the whole pipeline basically set up from field to conversion process? And many of the plants that I showed you in that table that I took off the internet, off of Wikipedia, many of those plants have that whole situation set up. In particular, there's a plant in Tennessee, in Vonore, Tennessee, that was sourcing switchgrass biomass from its neighbors and demonstrating the whole supply chain from start to finish. Almost all those plants have had significant grant money and subsidy money from DOE to get started and to get rolling. I don't think anybody's just really demonstrated a profitable approach to it yet. One of the reasons we're excited about these potential breakthroughs that I talked about tonight.
Is Virent's company here in Madison still doing work on that line, or are they concentrating on their plastic supply agreement with Coca-Cola?
I can't speak to what Virent's doing right now. I do know that they sort of moved away from this last time I'd heard, but I don't know the answer. Tom?
5 years ago, right now, they were tearing up the railroad that was serving Charter Street heating plant, because originally in 2010 we were going to convert that over to burning biomass, and then Governor Walker said, no, we're not going to do that. Is there any large-scale biomass heating plant like that around that you can study, since you can't study that one?
Are there any large-scale biomass combustion facilities like the cogen facility here at Charter Street that could be studied? I know that they have a plant in southeastern Minnesota, maybe one in northeastern Iowa as well, that Alliant Energy may be involved in. I'm out over my skis here a little bit, but I know that
they closed the Cassville one.
Pardon?
They closed the Cassville.
Oh, they closed the Cassville one. So there have been attempts. There are some out there. I can't name them off the top of my head.
Norway, Sweden, and Finland do that a lot. You can put this on the road. Your research is mostly on the Midwest.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Any other questions?
If not, thank you very much.